All right, how's it going, everyone? Today we are going to be talking about topic 8.4, depressive, bipolar, anxiety disorders, and obsessive compulsive disorders. So here we go. So let's start with the depressive disorders. The only depressive disorder that we need mention is major depressive. So um, the the major thing that you need to recognize about major depressive disorder is what is happening in the brain. So we have a PET scan over here on the right that is taking a look at two different brains. One is depressed and one is not depressed. And you can see very clearly that the depressed brain is not very active and that the non-depressed brain is, doing things. And so when we are looking at major depressive disorder, we have to recognize that the major aspect of it is a lack of brain activity. The brain's just not very active. So um, for those of us who've dealt with depression before, it's a recognition of everything just takes that much more energy to do. Um, Everything takes that much more energy to get involved in. Um, Waking up in the morning takes a lot of energy. Um, Laughing at a friend's jokes just takes a lot out of us because our brain just really isn't doing much of anything. When looking at major depressive disorder, we're looking at the most commonly diagnosed psychological disorder in the US. Um, People with major depressive disorder are at a higher risk for suicide. Um, I'm going to leave it at that. I think, in a very real sense, we all have a decent idea of what's going on here, and this is about all that you need to know. Make sure that when you're looking at major depressive disorder, there's no cause, like no life cause to it. So if a person has just lost a family member in the last 2 months, they're going to show all the signs of major depressive disorder, but you wouldn't call it major depressive disorder because there's a reasoning behind it. But 6 months down the road, if they're still feeling the exact same and haven't gotten any better, then you might start looking at this as a disorder. So, you know, life can sometimes um, give us the brain chemistry or the brain makeup for depressive, for someone who's depressed, but doesn't necessarily mean that it is a disorder. Okay, so next we have bipolar and related disorder. So bipolar and related disorder, again, there's a couple other disorders that go along with this, but we're only going to talk about bipolar. So bipolar disorder is the juxtaposition of someone who has what we would call a mania or going through a manic stage and a depressive stage. So patients with bipolar disorder will go through periods of mania, which is the opposite of depression. So high amounts of brain activity. They'll be in that stage for a week or 2 weeks or a month, and then they'll go through a depressive state for a week or 2 weeks and a month. It's not this flip-flop thing that happens back and forth constantly. It's something that you're in for a while, and then you'll move into something else for another extended period of time. So you're already fairly familiar with depression. So let's talk a little bit about mania. What does mania make up? Um, Patients who are going through a mania stage, um, uh, as you said, it's the opposite of depression. So their brain is very active. It's firing on all cylinders. Just think about when you have something very exciting that you are trying to sort out, and your brain is just running at a million miles an hour. Maybe it's a new like piece of gossip that you're just like, I can't believe this is going on, and so your brain's running really, really, really fast. Um, and so oftentimes you'll have people who talk really, really fast as they, are attempting to get out what's in their brain. And so they'll talk, 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 talk. Oftentimes this makes it difficult for the patient to sleep because their brain is running really fast. We all know how difficult it is to fall asleep if our brain is very, very active. Oftentimes patients will feel like an overinflated sense of self. They'll feel very powerful. They'll feel like they can do anything. They'll feel correct and right in all of their decisions and that everything that they do is the right thing to do. And oftentimes and detrimentally, they'll believe that their choices are right when oftentimes those choices are really bad for them. And oftentimes they do things that really isn't a good idea. Emptying bank accounts to go on shopping sprees, sleeping with someone out of wedlock, all sorts of stuff that can be a major detriment to them. So bipolar disorder, it's going through these two different stages and not always having control of it. The difference between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. Bipolar 1, a patient will have manic stages. They can also have what are known as hypomanic stages, which is mania, but all those symptoms, but a little less potent. And then someone with bipolar 2, they will only have hypomania and depressive stages. They'll never have a manic stage. So bipolar 2 is just a less intense version of bipolar 1. Okay, so anxiety disorders. So um, we have several disorders that fall under anxiety, and there's a couple things to note on this. Anxiety disorders are, disorders that deal with anxiety and fear, fear of things that have happened in the past, anxiety over the things of the future, but also it's a major category that deals with maladaptive behaviors. So oftentimes the reason why this becomes a problem is because the patients are their behaviors to relieve their anxiety or relieve their fears oftentimes are not good for them, and oftentimes make the problem worse. And so one of the major aspects of anxiety disorders is the patients doing specific things to try to help relieve the tension, but those things aren't really very helpful, and in the long term make things worse. So let's start with the first. The first is going to be phobias. So phobias are intense fears of something. So when you're talking about specific phobias, this can be anything from spiders to heights to tight spaces, bridges, speaking in public. These are all different types of specific phobias. It's to say, you're never going to be asked to know all of the different types of phobias, arachnophobia or triskaidekaphobia or whatever they are. Only two phobias that you are going to need to remember are agoraphobia and social phobia, also known as social anxiety disorder. So agoraphobia is fear of non-specific situations. So getting on a train, being in a crowd, getting in line, being in open spaces or enclosed spaces, being out of the house. Those are all signs of agoraphobia. Most time what will happen is people with agoraphobia will stay indoors and they won't go out and they won't go and do anything. Social anxiety disorder is fear of interacting with people. Oftentimes the fear is of being judged, that people will judge them for whatever they do, that anything that they say, they'll be mocked or belittled for that, and so they just kind of stay away from those types of interactions because they don't want to be mocked. So the big thing with phobias is, yes, there's intense fear, but oftentimes it's what the patients do in order to avoid the situations. So staying away. So, people with agoraphobia will stay in their house, for, months on end, or just, will rarely ever leave, because they're afraid of, what's out there. And so they won't interact. And so, they might not pursue jobs that they could obtain, because they don't want to leave the house. So again, this is like, hey, I'm doing a specific behavior of avoidance in order to, quell my fears, but that's not solving the problem. It's avoiding the problem, and that's a maladaptive behavior, and it's not really making you better. So next we have generalized anxiety disorder, GAD. Generalized anxiety disorder is exactly what it says. It is a person that is tense for extended periods of time. They are irritable, they're restless, and they are these things for no real reason. They're anxious about everything, but there's no real reason why they should be so anxious about what is going on. So they feel on the edge. And again, someone who has a bar exam coming up in 2 weeks would show signs of GAD. This is my final test to become a lawyer. Like, this is crazy. This is, super important. And people with GAD will have that same type of restlessness, but there's no like underlying cause. So everything, is a trigger. Everything creates tension and anxiety, but there's no real reason why they should be feeling this way. So that's generalized anxiety disorder. Okay, so next we have panic disorder. Starting at the base, panic disorder deals with panic attacks. Panic attack is, just this awful feeling. It manifests in many different ways, whether that be, heart beating really fast, feeling as if you're dying, feeling of derealization, feeling dizzy, nauseous, sweating. So lots of different symptoms, but overall it's just absolutely miserable, and people with panic disorder have them over and over and over again, multiple episodes of this intense dread. And oftentimes they feed off of one another, where a person will have a panic attack in a certain situation, and then later on they'll think about, oh, hey, I've got to go back into that situation, and then they start worrying about, oh, well, maybe I'll have another panic attack, and then all these fears start, and then it builds and builds and builds, and then they're having a panic attack because they're concerned about later on having a panic attack, and it just feeds off itself. And if you've asked anyone who's had a panic attack, it's pretty awful, and having a lot of them would not be enjoyable. So we are out of anxiety disorders. We're into our last section, our obsessive compulsive and related disorders. So we'll start with obsessive compulsive disorder. And it's fairly simple. It's right in the name, obsessive compulsive. So a person has an obsession about something, and that obsession compulses them to do something, and that compulsion is supposed to relieve that obsession. So a person has these thoughts that they can't get out of their head. They're driving, they're like really, eclipsing everything. They can't think about other things. They can't have conversations. And so they are compulsed to do something, and that something relieves that obsession. And so this is another classical example of a maladaptive behavior. The example in the picture there is germophobia has a high comorbidity with obsessive compulsive. So someone will brush up against something that they think is dirty or whatever, and so then in their head they're just like, oh my gosh, my hands are dirty, like I gotta, I might get a disease, or I might get sick, or this could have this disease on it, or these germs could do this to me. And so they can't stop thinking about it. Maybe they were in the middle of a conversation, but now this is completely taking over, and so until they go and wash their hands, they can't get that out of their head. But once they do wash their hands, they're in the clear. So that's obsessive compulsive. You have some type of obsession. It's taking over your brain, like it's all consuming. It's everything. And then we are compulsed to do something in order to relieve that obsession. And it's a maladaptive behavior, and it doesn't help in the long run. Okay, so kind of in that same vein, we have hoarding disorder. So hoarding disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder are, two peas in the same pod. The hoarding disorder is similar in the sense that a person has this obsession, the obsession being that the item that they are holding or the item that they have will have future importance. So this book that, my great-grandparents had, and it's old and ratty, I'm going to need this later, or this receipt that I got from, the fast food restaurant, I might need that later. And so, I've got a box full of receipts from random restaurants, piled high from years and years and years. And so it's this obsession that everything they use has some sort of importance, and the compulsion is just to store it, to hold on to that thing, and to, not release it. So the last two things, trichotillomania and excoriation disorder, these are two different disorder. First, trichotillomania, this is the hair pulling disorder. Again, we have an obsession, something that is driving them, something that is all-consuming. And in order to release or to get out of this this obsessive thought, they are compulsed to pull their hair. So they'll pull it from their eyebrows, they'll pull their eyelashes, their head, pull their arm hair, leg hair, just wherever it is. And this relieves that of those obsessive thoughts. It is painful. People oftentimes try to stop, but when you have an obsessive thought that you can't get rid of, and the only way of doing that is to pull your hair, oftentimes, they will continue to do it. Excoriation disorder is the same thing, except for instead of hair pulling, this is the skin picking disorder, where the patients will pick their skin, pull out scabs, make themselves bleed, and that is the only way to get rid of those obsessive thoughts. Yes, this causes distress. Yes, this is painful, but this is still the only way to stop those obsessive thoughts from being in there. So it's kind of, you do whatever you can to get those thoughts to go away. Okay. All right. So this is it for 8.4. Thank you very much for stopping by. Y'all have a good one, and we'll see you later.